Away from election-related news, the Food and Drugs Authority, FDA, has assured that the COVID-19 test it carries out at the Kotoka International Airport is reliable. A lead virologist at the Noguchi Memorial Institute, Dr. Kofi Bonny, had earlier stated that about half of antigen tests conducted are inaccurate. In a statement, the authority says those claims are inaccurate and unscientific. Mr. Eric Akari-Boateng is head of Laboratory Service Department at the FDA. He joins the show via Zoom. Thank you, sir, for joining our show this morning. First, let me just find out from you if Dr. Bonny's statement, according to you, or his claim, according to your statement, are unscientific and inaccurate. Is this in specific regard to the test being carried out at the Kotoka International Airport, or the general statement itself is problematic? Hi, Mr. Boateng, if you can unmute your device, we can't hear you.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah. First, I would like to make a point out to the Food and Drugs Authority does not carry tests at the airport.
No, I'm
the
not.
Only thing the FDA that it has granted an authorization for the device to be used to detect the SARS-CoV-2 virus from nasopharyngeal swabs. So we are not carrying out the test. Our duty is to ensure that the device being used is fit for its intended purpose.
Definitely,
we get
sir.
That one, right?
Sure. I do agree. Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, your question.
Now, I'm asking you, in your statement, you say the claims made by Dr. Bonny are inaccurate and unscientific. And I'm asking if that is with regard to the specific device you have given approval for, or you find his general statement problematic.
With respect to the device that we've given approval to, and based on the data that we have here from March 12, when the SARS-CoV-2 virus got into Ghana, up to date, especially with respect to RDTs, that's both antigen and antibody kits.
Okay.
And the device at the airport is not a rapid diagnostic test kit.
What is it?
It is a device based on immunofluorescence assay. That's whereby the device, it detects antigens. In the device, there's an antibody. So when you extract the swab, the nasopharyngeal swab, and dissolve it in a buffer, you place it in a cassette and then insert it in the device. So in the device, there's a reaction that takes place between an antibody that is coated on a plate in the device together. If there's a virus, it reacts with it. You get the antigen-antibody complex, which falls on an emporium nanoparticles, which then emit fluorescence for the device to record it and then give you your results. Can be printed out manually or connected to a computer and printed out. So it is not a point of care diagnostic whereby you just can read with the naked eye.
All right.
That's not it.
All right, Mr. Boateng, quite technical there. We'll try and break it down so our audience, especially those without a science background, can understand. But the confusion for many people is initially at the airport during the press briefing, we kept hearing that when passengers arrive at the airport, they were going to have a PCR test conducted. Then later we heard it was going to be an antigen test. Then later, right here on this platform, in this studio, we had the aviation minister say it was a higher form or more advanced form of an antigen test. So what really is it? We are very confused.
It's a device that detects, I repeat, that detects the virus, that's the SARS-CoV-2 virus, from nasopharyngeal swabs. And the SARS-CoV-2 virus is the antigen. So no, the virus, it has antigenic particles on its surface. So it's the antigenic particles on the surface of the virus that reacts with an antibody specific to SARS-CoV-2 in the machine, and then this antigen-antibody complex is then detected by a nanoparticle, which then fluorescence, and then the readout comes on the device.
Okay, and Mr. Boateng, let me just ask you this as well. So when Dr. Bonny spoke on Newsnight on Joy FM, he did mention that that's the Noguchi Memorial Institute had conducted some tests similar to this. And let me just say that when he was speaking, he did say that he didn't know exactly what was going to be used at the Kotoka International Airport. So he was speaking in general terms, comparing PCRs to antigen tests. Okay, so he says that...
Excuse me, what type of antigen test? Is it a point of care antigen test or a device. They are two different things.
You've established that. I'm also just trying to put in some context to his claims. Okay, so what he told us was that some of the tests conducted at Noguchi were negative, and then later they had PCR tests conducted that proved positive for COVID. So he was just trying to establish the disadvantages of using an antigen test. But you're telling us that that is not the same test. This device being used at the airport, is it the first time we're going to be using this in Ghana?
I'm going to answer your question, but then if you look through our statement, since March up to date, we have tested this RDT device and this rapid diagnostic test kit. And the sensitivity we told you ranges from 4 to 62. That is why the FDA in its wisdom has never approved any antigen or antibody rapid diagnostic test kit for the detection of the SARS-CoV-2 virus.
Okay.
Yeah, that is clear in our statement. So if you read it, you see.
Yes.
Then you are now talking about the immunofluorescence. Yes, this is the first device that we have approved here, but there are subsequent devices that are still going through the process. And it has also been approved by other stringent regulatory authorities as stated in our statement. And
so can you give us the percentage? I know with these tests, there's always a margin of error and you allow for some of, some, nuances and all. So what's the margin of error for this device?
Yeah, if you read our press statement, and on our website, the guidelines for devices are there. The gold standard is PCR because now there's no international reference antibody or antigens available. So it is compared to a PCR, which is the gold standard now. Okay. And we tell you that specificity, the machine should be specific. That if you have SARS-CoV-2, it should tell you that SARS-CoV-2 and not any other viral disease. Okay. That one we say it should not be less than 99.0%. It's in our release, it's on our website. Then for sensitivity, how accurate can the machine detect if SARS-CoV-2 is present? That one is also 99%. So for a device to be qualified and approved and be put on the market, it has to meet this acceptance criteria. All right. And this was what was done.
All right, Mr. Boateng, I'll have you hold on. I've been joined also by Dr. Yalbediakun. He is an immunologist with the West African Center for Cell Biology and Infectious Pathogens. Thank you for joining the program, sir. So we've heard from the FDA. They say the claims by Dr. Boni are inaccurate and unscientific with regards to the particular device they have approved for use at the Kotoka International Airport. What do you make of this whole debate?
Thank you for having me. First of all, I would like to say that it's a little bit difficult as a scientist to evaluate the device because currently the FDA have not disclosed the name of the device. So they've told us that it's a fluorescence immunoassay, as Mr. Boateng has just explained. I understand how these devices work. It's basically a lateral flow device. So the idea is you have a membrane with antibodies on it. You pass over a solution that will contain your sample, and if there is virus present, then the antigen, which is usually a protein on the virus, will bind to this antibody. Then you wash over with another solution. In this case, he's saying it contains a nanoparticle that can fluoresce. So the fluorescence is basically the way you detect it. It is similar really to the RDT devices. The RDTs are also laminar flow devices. The RDTs are basically manual versions of what Mr. Boateng is describing as this larger device that is somewhat more complex in that it is automated and you get a digital readout of the sample.
But would it be more accurate than a rapid diagnostic test device?
Well, once again, I would say rapid diagnostic test on its own doesn't necessarily define the test. You can have a rapid diagnostic antibody test and you can have a rapid diagnostic antigen test. Antibody tests are typically less sensitive because they depend on their body's immune response to make an antibody response. That will take some time. And that is why the FDA, and I agree with them in this case, have not approved any antibody tests because antibody tests only are markers of exposure, not current infection. Antigen tests, on the other hand, do tell you that somebody is currently infected. The challenge, however, is that typically when you compare antigen tests to PCR, and I think this is what Dr. Boni was referring to, historically, when you compare antigen tests to PCR tests, like Mr. Boateng himself has said, are the gold standard. The reason is that PCR is a molecular test. It's not an antigen test. Molecular tests amplify nucleic acid. They amplify DNA or RNA. that is in a sample. And so the limit of detection is much lower. If you have very little of the virus present, PCR can detect it because PCR naturally will amplify whatever small substance you have. With antigen tests, they just detect what is there. So if it is possible that somebody could be viral positive, but their level of virus, their viral load is very, very low, in that case, PCR would detect them, but an antigen test would not. So I believe that the question here with this, I have looked up these FIA devices. The US FDA has approved one called the Sophia that is made by Quiddle. I don't know if that is the same device that is being used in Ghana. Mr. Boating might be able to tell us. But the Quiddle has been talked about as being a quite sensitive antigen test. The only challenge with the Quiddle is that when, I think the company said that their sensitivity was around 96.7% based on what I can find online. Now, the only thing I would say about the Quiddle, however, is that it was approved for use with symptomatic people. Okay. So when you talk about calculating sensitivity of an assay, it also depends on who you are testing it on. If you test it on people who are very sick, who have high viral loads, then of course they have a lot of virus. So their sensitivities would be very high. So I know at least for the Quiddle device, the Sophia, I'm not sure if it's the same device used in Ghana. That device has only been approved for people who are showing symptoms within the first 5 days.
All right.
Now, what I would say is that, just let me,
please go ahead.
At the airport, obviously, because people have already had a negative PCR test that has been mandated by the government, and they will not be allowed to board a plane with any symptoms. They'll check your temperature before you board. All these people who come will be asymptomatic. And so the question that I have that I would like to pose to the FDA and to others, and I think that is what Dr. Boni, I believe, was trying to get to, was that if majority of the people you are testing on are asymptomatic, and this device, if it is the device, I'm not sure once again, but the Quiddle device is only approved for people who are symptomatic because they have high viral load. So the question we have is that for people who are coming off a plane, who are not symptomatic, who presumably have, if they are positive, have very little virus in there, it is possible that PCR might be the only device that could detect them. I believe that is where we have a challenge.
Okay,
of course, PCR takes longer and it's a bit more expensive. So trade-off between antigen testing and PCR testing has to do with speed and cost. All
right. Let me get Mr. Kakari Boating to respond to exactly what kind of device it is. He's told us what device it is, but what brand is it? Mr. Boating, can you help us with an answer to that? Hi, sorry, can you kindly unmute again?
Yeah, he's right. He said it's an antibody it's an antigen immunofluorescence assay, but the brand that is registered here is not Quiddle.
Okay, what brand is it?
It's not Quiddle.
What brand is it, sir?
It's called AFIA 6. AFIA 6 from South Korea. It's called AFIA 6.
Okay, from South Korea.
The brand. And he was saying something, but he Dr. The name again.
Bediako, Dr. Yao Bediako.
Bediako was saying something. Yeah, before we approve a device, the first regulatory thing you look at for is the limit of detection and the limit of quantification. There are even some PCRs that cannot detect below 400 copies per mil. Okay. Some 500 copies they cannot. The most sensitive ones I've seen, that's around 200 copies per mil, and it depends on even the stage of infection, as he rightly said. So yes, like from the point that he's making, the key thing that you look is the limit of detection. And then the limit of quantification, the amount of viral copies that the machine can quantify with accuracy and then specificity. All
right. So this AFIA device, can you help us spell it out so those who want to just also do the cross checks with the device can do?
Pardon?
Can you help us spell out the device? I heard you say something AFIA, but I don't know.
AFIAS 6. AFIAS 6.
Okay. All right.
And mind you, for now, there is no international reference standard, both for the antigen and then the antibody for SARS-CoV-2 virus. It was only last week that the ECBS, that's the Expert Standards Committee on Biologics, or the WHO, authorized that international reference standards should be developed for both the antigen and then the antibody.
All right.
So if they are, in accordance with best regulatory practice, if there are no antigen, there are no standards, you compare with the gold standard, and that was what was done.
Okay. So, Dr. Abediako, back to you. So, 72 hours before passengers embark on a flight to Ghana, they're expected to take a PCR test, who we have just told is a gold standard test. Now, when they come in, they will take this antigen test. Is that not foolproof enough?
So, I mean, I believe, well, foolproof with COVID, I'm sure even Mr. Barton will agree, you know, we are trying, you know, foolproof is difficult to ascertain. This virus is challenging to detect, and we are doing our best. I believe both the FDA, Noguchi, the Ministry of Health, everybody is doing their best to try to get ahead of this virus. The reason, so 72 hours, a number of countries have implemented this 72-hour requirement, because the idea is you don't want people getting on a plane as they are positive, because then they could infect each other on the plane. Now, of course, the reason that some are arguing, so some countries only mandate 72 hours. If you have a PCR result, so I think places like Dubai, others, if you have a 72-hour PCR, you can enter the country without any further testing. Now, in Ghana, we are trying to have an extra layer of protection by saying that something could happen to you between the 72 hours. And for that reason, we want to test when you arrive. Now, the issue is the virus has an incubation period of 5.1 days. So if I had a PCR done today and I'm traveling in 3 days, in 72 hours, if I got infected within those 3 days, the virus would be within its incubation period. And so the virus would be replicating, but probably replicating very slowly. So even if I arrived in Ghana after that 72 hours and I did a test, the question is, am I, and this is what Mr. Barton was referring to as the limit of detection, is my viral load sufficiently high to be detected? And this is a question we have to ask even for PCR. But so I believe the question we have is, if whatever test we are using has to be as sensitive as possible, because we are only looking at a very, very narrow window when most people would have very little viral material at that time. So the question that we have to ask, I believe, is the test we are using good enough or sensitive enough to detect people who would be on the borderline of limit of detection? Now, I have not yet, I'm happy now we know it's the FIA6, and many of us will go and look into it, I'm sure. I don't know off the top of my head what the limit of detection of the FIA6 is compared to, for instance, a PCR. But if there is a difference, then the question then remains, well, are we going to have some people who enter, test negative because they are below the limits of detection, and so therefore would pose a risk? And that it is that fraction of people, obviously, that we'd be most concerned about, because they are the people that we are trying to stop entering. So the rationale for the 72-hour window makes sense, but it also places a very high burden of detection on our test in Ghana, because our test in Ghana now is not looking for people who are symptomatic. It's not looking for people who probably have lots of virus. It is trying to capture people who are within 3 days of an infection, and so most likely would have very, very little virus.
All right.
So I believe that is where the controversy and some of the discussion has been, is historically we know that gold standard is PCR, then it's antigen, then it's antibody. So the question is, why are we using an antigen test? Why are we not using a PCR test, since we want to have a very, very high sensitivity? But of course, like I said, there are other considerations that are being weighed. So I think that is where the discussion has to be. How good is the AFIA6 machine? Mr. Barton is saying that it is comparable to PCR. The question is it comparable to PCR in people who are already sick, or is it comparable to PCR in people who are completely asymptomatic? And that is perhaps the data that would clear up this whole discussion.
I appreciate your time here this morning. Dr. Abediako is an immunologist with the West African Center for Cell Biology of Infectious Pathogens. We also had Mr. Eric Akaribuating, head of the Laboratory Service Department at the FDA, who've approved the device that we are going to be using at our airports. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your day. If we have any other questions, we'll reach out to you. But for now, that'll be it.
There's something you are leaving out. There's something you are leaving out.
Which is what, Mr. Boating, quickly, please.
No, he said something. No, he said something which you are trying to leave out, but which I think it should be clarified.
What do you want to clarify?
Right, Dr. Abediako is right in saying that you have to look at the stage, at which, and the stage the period in which you are determining the infection.
Yeah.
And when you are qualifying equipment, you look at both worst case scenario and then the easy case scenario.
So do we know if this device will be able to detect asymptomatic carriers of COVID.
Otherwise, the FDA wouldn't have put it. Wouldn't have approved it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kakari Boateng is head of Laboratory Service Department at the FDA, and Dr. Yabedi Ako, thank you so much.